After my wife's funeral, I never mentioned the second house, or the $480,000 she left me. A week later, my son said, "Start packing. The house is sold." I smiled. I had already packed. But they weren't my... George Walker stood alone beside the grave, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the brim of his hat. The late summer sun hovered gently above the quiet cemetery in Springfield, Illinois, casting long shadows on the pale headstones that surrounded him. Mary's name was freshly etched into polished granite. Mary Louise Walker, beloved wife, mother, friend. No middle name. No dates just yet. The engraver would return next week for those. For now, the loss was too raw for Stone to finalize. People came and went, some muttering empty condolences, others offering polite embraces that meant little. His son, Ryan, lingered by the car, checking his phone more often than acknowledging the mourners. His daughter Emma arrived late, her eyes hidden behind sunglasses too large for the occasion. Even Mary's sister, Lorraine, spent more time complaining about the heat than reminiscing. Grief, George realized, had become transactional, a formality wrapped in black attire and shallow sympathy. He said very little. He never had been a talkative man, and now words failed him entirely. But beneath the silence, something pulsed. Not sorrow, not entirely. Something steadier, more calculated. Because George knew something no one else at that funeral did. Mary, his wife of 42 years, had left him more than memories. 2 weeks before she passed, in a lucid stretch between painkillers and sleep, Mary had whispered from her hospital bed, "There's a second house in Wisconsin and $480,000 for you, only you, if things get bad." Her voice had cracked at the last word, but her eyes, glassy as they were, remained sharp. She had made him promise not to tell anyone. Not yet. So George had nodded, kissed her forehead, and waited. Now, standing in front of the flowers and the pastor and the barely restrained family tension, George kept her secret buried deeper than the casket. No one had asked much about Mary's affairs. Ryan had taken over most responsibilities within hours of the death. There were spreadsheets, emails to the lawyer, calls to the bank. Emma had floated in and out, offering support when convenient. George remained on the edges, watching, waiting. Their house on Maple Lane was quiet that night. The casseroles brought by neighbors lined the counter untouched. George wandered through each room like a ghost, pausing at photos, fingering bookshelves, touching doorknobs. Everything reeked of Mary, lavender and lemon oil, and the subtle trace of her favorite lotion. The bedroom, still holding her scent, felt off limits. He climbed into the attic just past midnight. Dust and cobwebs greeted him. Boxes labeled Christmas and old taxes sat in piles. Near the far wall, he found what he had come for, a small, locked chest Mary once told him about but never showed. The key had been tucked in her jewelry box, hidden under the lining. Inside, he found documents. A deed to a small lake house in a town called Crandon, Wisconsin. A savings account under only her name. And the letter, dated 7 months before her death. If you're reading this, then I'm gone. And you're probably being pushed around already. She had known. The kids love us, but they don't understand us. They won't understand this. So don't try. Take the house. Take the money. Disappear if you must. You don't owe them anything now but love. And love doesn't mean sacrifice anymore. He read the letter 3 times. Each time slower than the last. George closed the chest, locked it again, and returned it to the attic. He made no plans that night. But something inside him shifted. A quiet goodbye was one thing. The silence after that would be his to control. By morning, Ryan had already begun dividing tasks. He handed George a checklist of things to cancel, sell, or pack. Emma suggested they get help from a real estate agent sooner rather than later. Chelsea, Ryan's wife, was already taking pictures of furniture for listings. George sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling in his hand. As the world around him began to rearrange itself without him, they barely looked at him when making decisions, as if he were a fixture in a home, not the man who built it. He smiled to himself. They would never expect what was coming. They didn't know about Crandon. They didn't know about the money. They didn't know that Mary had seen them clearly, all along. George had learned to stay silent in his life. Not because he had nothing to say, but because silence was his way of surviving, and now it would be his way of winning. That afternoon, while Ryan was in the basement taking inventory and Chelsea was measuring the dining table, George made a quiet call to a locksmith and a moving company. He gave them an address in Wisconsin. By nightfall, a single suitcase sat by the door. George didn't need much. The real weight he carried was in the silence he kept and the legacy Mary had quietly built just for him. Tomorrow, they would learn the house was already sold. But George, he was already gone. George awoke the following week to the sound of heavy knocks at the front door. The house was quiet otherwise, the kind of quiet that felt foreign now that Mary's presence no longer filled it. He moved slowly down the hall, his steps deliberate, his breath steady. When he opened the door, his son Ryan stood there, sharply dressed in a suit, papers tucked under his arm. His expression carried no trace of warmth. It was all business. Behind him, Chelsea leaned against their black SUV, her arms folded, scanning the street as though she had already claimed the neighborhood as her own. "Morning, Dad," Ryan said briskly. "We need to talk." George let him in without a word, and Ryan walked directly to the kitchen table, setting down the stack of documents. He pulled out a chair, motioned for his father to sit, and spread the pages across the wood surface. "The house is sold. The new owners take possession in 3 days. You'll need to be out by then." George remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. His eyes lingered on his son, not on the documents. Ryan mistook the silence for confusion and continued in a tone that teetered between impatience and authority. "It's a good deal, Dad. We got an offer right away, above asking price. Honestly, you should be grateful. You won't have to worry about upkeep, taxes, or any of the stress. You can just start fresh somewhere smaller, more manageable. Without asking me?" George asked finally, his voice low but steady. Ryan's jaw tightened. "We're just trying to help. You shouldn't be in a big house like this alone. It doesn't make sense. And besides, the longer we held on to it, the more bills we'd rack up. This was a practical move. Trust me, it's for the best." George pulled out the chair across from Ryan and sat down. He picked up one of the pages, glanced at the legal jargon and signatures, and set it back down without comment. "And where exactly did you plan for me to go?" Chelsea chose that moment to step inside. She slipped off her sunglasses, revealing sharp eyes that flicked between George and Ryan. "We thought maybe a retirement community. There are a few good ones near us. Closer to family, more support. You'd have everything you need without all this responsibility." George let out a breath that could have been mistaken for agreement, but the faintest smile touched his lips. "I'll figure something out," he said simply. Ryan leaned forward, his elbows on the table. "Dad, you don't understand. You need to start packing. The buyers want a clean handover. We can't risk them backing out." George studied his son's face. The urgency wasn't about his well-being. It was about control. The papers, the deadlines, the decisions made without him, all of it pointed to one thing. Ryan was moving fast because he wanted the outcome sealed before George had time to object. Greed had replaced grief quicker than George could have imagined, but Mary had anticipated it. She had left him prepared. "I've already started," George said quietly. "My things are almost ready to go." Ryan blinked, caught off guard. "Good. That's good." He gathered the documents again, sliding them into his folder. "I'll have movers come by tomorrow to take care of the rest. Don't worry about anything heavy." "Don't bother," George replied, standing. "I'll handle it myself." For the first time that morning, Chelsea spoke directly to him. "You're being stubborn, George. This isn't about control. It's about doing what's right for everyone. You can't expect to live the way you always have. Things change." George gave her a look that carried both sadness and resolve. "Things do change. That's true, but not always in the way you expect." They left soon after, satisfied that he had accepted their plan, not realizing how wrong they were. As the SUV disappeared down the street, George closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. Their eagerness to strip the house from him only strengthened his resolve. He had been ready to go before they even arrived, not because of their orders, but because Mary had set the path for him. That afternoon, George packed the last of his essentials into 2 suitcases. Clothes, photographs of Mary, a box of old letters she had written him during their early years, and a leather-bound notebook where he planned to record everything that unfolded from here on. The rest of the furniture and belongings he left behind. The house, stripped of what mattered, no longer belonged to him in spirit, even if legally it had until Ryan's hasty sale. By evening, he loaded the suitcases into the back of his aging sedan. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and summer rain, and the streetlights buzzed as they flickered on. He walked through each room one last time, pausing briefly in the living room where Mary's rocking chair still sat angled toward the window. He touched the backrest gently, then stepped away without looking back. The next morning, while Ryan arranged for movers and Chelsea busied herself with utility cancellations, George drove north. He didn't leave a note, didn't announce his departure. By the time they returned to check on him, the house would be empty. The silence they had ignored for so long would finally speak volumes. On the highway out of Springfield, George felt something unexpected. Relief. The road stretched ahead of him, long and open, and for the first time since the funeral, he wasn't suffocated by the weight of other people's plans. He wasn't being told where to go or how to live. The secret Mary had entrusted to him carried him forward like a compass, pointing him toward Wisconsin, toward something untouched by Ryan's ambition or Chelsea's practicality. At a rest stop just past Rockford, George sat at a picnic table with a thermos of coffee. He pulled out the deed from his jacket pocket, unfolded it, and studied the neat print. The address in Crandon felt like a promise, a destination waiting with open arms. He imagined the lake house surrounded by trees, perhaps a quiet dock where Mary had once stood alone. He had no photographs of it, no memories of his own, but he carried Mary's vision with him. She had built a refuge he hadn't even known he needed until now. By the time he reached Wisconsin, the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple. He passed through small towns where diners still advertised meatloaf specials and children rode bicycles down quiet streets. It felt like stepping back in time, into a slower world where people still wave at strangers. It was exactly the kind of place Mary would have chosen, ordinary on the surface, extraordinary in its peace. When he finally pulled into the gravel driveway of the lake house, George killed the engine and sat for a long moment, staring at the cabin-like structure ahead. It was modest, wooden, with a porch that faced the water. The paint was weathered, but the windows glowed warmly in the fading light. He felt as though he had arrived not at a stranger's house, but at something familiar, as though Mary's spirit had been waiting for him there. George carried his suitcases inside, setting them down by the door. The air smelled faintly of cedar and lake water. On the mantel above the fireplace, a framed photo of Mary greeted him. She was younger, smiling in the sunlight, standing in front of the very same house. He ran his hand over the frame, his throat tightening. She had been here, often, and she had made sure he would find his way here too. The first night in the lake house, George didn't unpack. He sat on the porch instead, listening to the crickets and watching the moon reflect on the still water. For the first time since the funeral, he didn't feel displaced. He didn't feel like an old man being pushed out his own life. He felt like he had stepped into the next chapter Mary had written for him. Back in Springfield, Ryan was already planning what to do with the money from the house sale. But George, smiling faintly into the night, knew his son was already several steps behind. The following morning in Wisconsin, George woke earlier than usual. The lake was still misted over, a silver veil drifting across the calm surface. He stood at the porch window for a long moment, mug of coffee warming his hand, listening to the faint call of loons echoing across the water. Peace surrounded him, but beneath it a restlessness stirred. Mary's words replayed in his mind. If things get bad. She had known, down to the smallest detail, how their children might behave. She had left him instructions, not just a gift. After breakfast, George explored the house more thoroughly. He opened every closet, drawer, and trunk, searching not out of suspicion but out of instinct. The place was filled with small traces of Mary's secret life here. A recipe book filled with her handwriting, a half-finished quilt draped over a chair, Photographs of sunsets taken from the back porch. She had lived a second rhythm in this house, away from Springfield, building a retreat that she never once mentioned to children. When he reached the attic, he paused. The door was narrow, the stairs steep and creaky. Dust floated in the shafts of light that broke through the slats of the roof. Boxes were stacked high, some labeled, others unmarked. He spent nearly an hour sifting through them, careful not to stir too much dust into his lungs. Old fishing rods, picnic blankets, stacks of magazines from the early 2000s, all neatly packed away. And then, pushed against the far wall, he saw a small metal box, dented and rusted but locked with a simple latch. George carried it downstairs, set it on the dining table, and pried it open with a screwdriver. Inside, folded and worn, lay a sheaf of handwritten papers. At the top of the first page, in Mary's steady script, were the words, "Last will and testament, private copy." His heart tightened. She had indeed written her own version, outside of what the lawyer had drafted. He sat down slowly and began to read. The will was short but deliberate. She left the Wisconsin property and all associated accounts entirely to George, to be his alone, regardless of what the official documents might state. She acknowledged the children but was blunt in her reasoning. "I love them, but I have watched the seeds of entitlement grow in them. I know how quickly grief can turn into demand. This house and this money are not meant for them. They are meant for you, George. You have carried too much for too long." There were also notes in the margins, scribbled reminders to herself. "Don't forget, George will need proof. Keep copies of statements." Another, "Ryan is ambitious. Emma is softer, but she follows him too often." And at the end, a line that made George set the papers down for a moment and press his hands against his eyes. "If you are reading this, my love, it means I trusted you more than anyone else on this earth. Protect what I have left you, and when you are ready, build something new with it, something that feels alive." The room seemed to grow still as he absorbed her words. Mary hadn't just prepared for his survival. She had predicted every move of their children, mapped it out, and left it with the tools to fight back. He could almost hear her voice guiding him as he sat there. That evening, George lit a fire in the fireplace and reread the will under the flickering glow. He pictured the scene back in Springfield, Ryan speaking with lawyers, pressing banks for access, assuming his father was too meek to resist. The official paperwork may have been filed already, but Mary's hidden testament, while not legal in itself, proved her intentions. It was a weapon, one George would use when the time came. Later, as he tidied the dining table, he noticed something else inside the metal box, a smaller envelope, sealed and addressed simply to George. He tore it open carefully. Inside was a letter, no longer formal like the will, but personal, intimate. Mary had written it months before her illness worsened. She told him she had often visited the lake house when she needed peace from the chaos of family demands, when she needed to remember who she was before she became only a wife and mother. She explained that the house was more than property. It was a symbol of freedom, and she wanted him to feel it too. "Do not be afraid of their anger," the letter said. "They will accuse you of hiding, of being selfish, but you know better. Selfishness is taking what doesn't belong to you. This belongs to you, George. To us. Use it." He sat back in a chair, the fire popping softly, and felt the truth of her words settle over him like a blanket. For the first time since her funeral, he felt something more than grief or anger. He felt purpose. The next day, George drove into town to get supplies. Crandon was small, the kind of place where the grocery store doubled as a gathering spot, and the post office clerk knew everyone by name. He bought fresh bread, milk, and a few tools for small repairs around the house. At the counter, the woman ringing him up looked at him with recognition. "You must be Mary's husband," she said warmly. "She always talked about you, said this place was for you more than for her." George froze for a moment, the words hitting him with an unexpected force. "She spoke of me?" he asked, his voice rough. "All the time," the woman replied with a nod. "Said you'd need this place one day, that you'd understand why she kept it quiet. We all liked her. She was kind." On his drive back, George thought about the strength of Mary's foresight. Not only had she secured a retreat, but she had also woven herself into the fabric of the community. She had left him allies, people who already accepted him as part of their world. He felt less like a stranger and more like someone stepping into a role already prepared. That night, George worked on a list. He wrote down everything Mary had left him: the deed, the will, the savings, the letters. He categorized what was evidence, what was personal, and what might one day need to be shown to a judge. He wasn't ready to confront Ryan yet, but he knew the confrontation was inevitable. His son's ambition wouldn't stop at selling one house. When he finished, George tucked the will and the letters back into the metal box, which he then hid beneath a loose floorboard in the study. He tested the board several times, satisfied that no one would find it easily. As he lay in bed, the lake wind rustling through the trees, George closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "You saw it all, Mary, every step, and now I see it too." In the silence that followed, the house seemed to breathe with him. The hidden will had not only given him proof, but also clarity. The days of being quietly pushed aside were over. The game, though he never wanted one, had begun. The morning of the move arrived with a strange calm. The air in Springfield carried the heavy smell of late summer, dew clinging to the grass as the sun climbed lazily into the sky. George had returned from Wisconsin 2 nights earlier, deliberately quiet, deliberately unseen. He spent the evening before setting the table with care. A stack of pancakes, golden and steaming, a plate of bacon, eggs scrambled just the way Mary used to make them, and a pot of coffee that filled the kitchen with its earthy aroma. He knew Ryan and Chelsea would come, not because they cared to see him off, but because they wanted control over every step of his departure. When the knock came, George was already seated at the table, sipping from his mug. He called out for them to come in. Ryan entered first, his tie perfectly knotted despite the casual hour, his face flushed from irritation rather than exertion. Chelsea followed, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor. She glanced at the food with a flicker of surprise before pursing her lips. "You cooked," Ryan said, almost suspiciously, as though hospitality were a strategy. "I thought we could sit down before the chaos starts," George replied evenly. "It might be the last time we share a meal in this house." Reluctantly, Ryan pulled out a chair. Chelsea sat beside him, her eyes darting around the kitchen, as if she were already imagining how quickly it could be cleared out. George slid plates toward them and poured coffee without asking, the motions calm, deliberate. For a few moments, there was only the sound of forks against plates, the scrape of chairs, the quiet hum of the refrigerator. George watched them from across the table, not with hostility, but with an almost clinical detachment. He wanted to see how long it would take before Ryan broke the silence. It wasn't long. "Dad, about the bank account," Ryan began, his voice firm but measured, the tone of someone trying to steer a conversation toward his own ends. "You know the joint account you and Mom had? We need to settle it properly. I've already spoken with the attorney, and it's best if we transfer the balance into a trust. That way, it's easier to manage, less complicated for you." George set his fork down, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked at his son without flinching. "That account doesn't exist anymore," he said calmly. Ryan frowned, the first crack in his confidence. "What do you mean it doesn't exist?" "Of course it does. It's in both your names. We have to make sure it's handled right." "I closed it," George replied. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the words sink in. The silence that followed was thick. Chelsea's fork clattered softly against her plate, and Ryan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a sharper register. "Why would you do that without telling me? You should have discussed it. Now it'll be harder to get everything organized." "Not everything needs to be organized by you," George said, his tone steady but carrying an edge that made Chelsea glance at him more carefully. "I'm capable of making decisions on my own. This isn't a board meeting. Ryan, it's my life." Chelsea broke him before Ryan could respond. "We're only trying to make sure you're taken care of. You think it looks suspicious when you move money around right after Mom passes away? The banks notice those things. The courts notice them too." George turned his gaze on her, calm but unyielding. "Suspicion doesn't bother me. I know what I'm doing." Ryan pushed his plate away, no longer interested in food. "Dad, you're being unreasonable." You've always relied on me to handle the complicated stuff, and now suddenly you want to do it all yourself? It doesn't make sense. You can't keep secrets like this. If you move money somewhere else, you need to be transparent. Otherwise, people are going to start asking questions. I've always been transparent with your mother, George said softly. That's all that ever mattered. The words landed with weight, and for a moment Ryan was silent, his jaw tightening. Chelsea reached for a coffee but kept her eyes on George, searching for cracks in his calm. She found none. Finally, Ryan spoke again, sharper this time. You're making a mistake. You think you can manage all this alone, but you can't. Sooner or later, the truth will come out. It always does. George leaned back in his chair, folding his hands on the table. Then let it come out. I'll be fine. The room grew quiet again, the air charged with an unspoken battle. Ryan's frustration was evident in every twitch of his fingers, every impatient breath. He wanted control, and George's refusal to yield unsettled him. Chelsea, always more calculating, studied George with narrowed eyes. She wasn't convinced this was mere stubbornness. She suspected there was more beneath the surface. But George gave them nothing further. He rose from the table, carried his plate to the sink, and rinsed it clean. I appreciate your concern, he said, his back to them, but I'll be all right. You don't need to worry about me. Ryan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. We'll see about that, he muttered, gathering his papers into a neat stack. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. George turned, drying his hand with a towel, and met his son's eyes. Harder for who? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ryan didn't answer. He stormed out of the kitchen, Chelsea close behind. Before leaving, she cast one last glance at George, her lips pressed into a thin line, as though she were silently promising that they would not let this go. When the door closed behind them, George exhaled slowly. The pancakes on the table had grown cold, the coffee lukewarm, but the confrontation had given him something far more sustaining than food. Confirmation. Ryan and Chelsea were already circling, already digging for what they believed they were owed. Mary had predicted it with painful precision. George returned to the table, picked up his notebook, and jotted down a single line. They don't believe I can stand on my own. That is their greatest mistake. Outside, a moving truck rumbled slowly down the street, stopping in front of the house. Strangers would soon carry out the furniture, box up the remnants of decades, and leave the house bare. Ryan thought this was the beginning of an ending, but George knew better. This was only the beginning of something Mary had prepared long ago. 2 days after the tense breakfast, George was already settled in Wisconsin. The lake house, though unfamiliar in many ways, had begun to feel like a sanctuary. He spent his mornings walking the shoreline, collecting small stones that reminded him of Mary, and his afternoons repairing the small things she had left unfinished. A loose step on the porch, a squeaky hinge on the back door. At night, he wrote in his notebook by lamplight, documenting everything, as though keeping a record would help him make sense of the storm that was surely coming. Back in Illinois, however, Ryan and Chelsea were not idle. The breakfast confrontation had left them more suspicious than ever. George's calm confidence unsettled them. He hadn't acted like a man cornered. He had acted like someone with a plan. That was what gnawed at Ryan as he sat at his home office desk, late into the night, the glow of the computer screen lighting his face. Chelsea leaned over his shoulder, scrolling through online banking portals, searching for any trace of movement that could explain what George had done. Look at this, Chelsea murmured, pointing to a line on the screen. There's a transfer here, about 3 weeks before Mary died. A large one, $70,000. Not to our joint account, not to Bill's, not to anything we know about. Where did it go? Ryan rubbed his temples, his frustration building. He must have opened another account. He's hiding money. That's the only explanation. Dad doesn't just move money for no reason. Not that much. Chelsea leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Then he's not as clueless as he pretends. He knew exactly what he was doing when he closed the joint account. He's keeping something from us. Ryan stood and began pacing the room. He thinks he can outsmart us. That's what this is. He's hiding assets, maybe even property. Why else would he be so calm about losing the house? It doesn't add up. Anyone else in his position would be panicked, but not him. He smiled. Chelsea raised an eyebrow. So what do we do? We can't accuse him without proof. If we go to the lawyer now, it'll look like we're grasping at straws. He's your father, Ryan. People expect grief, not investigations. Ryan stopped pacing and turned toward her with sharp expression. Then we find the proof. We dig. He's not going to tell us, so we'll get ourselves. The next morning, while George was in Wisconsin pruning the bushes by the porch, Ryan began making calls. He contacted old family friends under the pretense of checking in. He asked leading questions, careful to disguise his curiosity as concern. Did anyone know if his father had been behaving strangely? Had they heard of any unusual purchases? He even called the family attorney to casually inquire about whether Mary had ever mentioned separate accounts. But no one gave him anything useful. Everyone spoke of George as they always had. Quiet, dependable, steady. No one suspected he was holding a secret. Frustrated, Ryan returned to the computer that night. Chelsea was already there, digging deeper into records. She had managed to track down a statement that hinted at another account number, one not connected to the accounts Ryan knew about. But there were no names attached, only partial information. This is enough to know he's hiding something, Chelsea said, tapping the screen. But it's not enough to confront him. He'll just deny it. Ryan clenched his fists. Then we'll keep watching. He slipped once, he'll slip again. And when he does, we'll be ready. Meanwhile, in Wisconsin, George had no idea how closely they were circling. He was too caught up in rediscovering pieces of Mary she had left scattered throughout the house. One afternoon, while searching through a dresser in the guest room, he found a notebook filled with her handwriting. It wasn't a will or instructions this time. It was a journal. She had written about her visits to the lake house, about the peace it gave her, about her fears for the children's future. On one page, she had written, "Ryan loves control more than people. He doesn't see it, but it consumes him. Emma wants harmony, but she gives in too easily. George will have to face them one day. I only hope he remembers that silence can be stronger than anger." George closed the journal and sat quietly for a long time. Mary had not only predicted the conflict, but had laid bare the flaws of their children with an almost painful clarity. It was both comforting and devastating to read her words. She had carried these thoughts alone, preparing him for a battle he hadn't even known was coming. That evening, George sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the lake. A knock on the door startled him. He turned and saw a neighbor, a woman in her late 60s with kind eyes and silver hair tied in a bun. She introduced herself as Helen. "I thought I'd come by," she said warmly. "Mary used to visit often. She spoke about you, said you'd come here eventually." George invited her in, and they shared tea at the dining table. Helen spoke of Mary with affection, recounting how she had attended local community events, helped with small fundraisers, and spent hours sitting by the lake just talking with anyone who passed by. "She always said this house was your refuge," Helen told him. "Said you'd need it when the time was right." George listened quietly, the confirmation both painful and reassuring. Mary had woven her life here without ever revealing it to the children. It was her final gift, a secret sanctuary meant only for him. While George felt the threads of peace tightening around him, Ryan and Chelsea were tightening their own net. Days later, Chelsea discovered that the $70,000 transfer had been the first of several. Smaller amounts had followed, leading into an account they couldn't fully trace. The realization was like blood in the water. "He's definitely hiding more," Chelsea said one night, her eyes sharp with determination. "We just have to find where. And once we do, we'll prove he's not the helpless widower everyone thinks he is." Ryan nodded, his expression hard. "He thinks he can play games with us. He has no idea how far I'm willing to go." In the quiet of the Wisconsin lake house, George continued writing in his notebook, unaware that his children were already circling closer, ready to strike. Mary had left him the means to defend himself, but the first shadows of their suspicion had already begun to fall across his peace. The first week in Wisconsin unfolded with a rhythm George hadn't felt in years. Each morning, The mist rolled across the lake and lifted slowly as the sun rose. The days stretched unhurried, filled with a hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the distant call of loons. For the first time since Mary's passing, George felt he could breathe without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing against his chest. On the third morning, while trimming the hedges along the gravel path, George noticed a woman walking slowly along the lakeside road. She carried a basket of vegetables, her steps deliberate but not strained. When she spotted George, she smiled warmly and raised a hand. "You must be George," she called out. George set down his shears and nodded, brushing the dirt from his hands. "And you are—" "Helen," she replied. "Helen Patterson. I live 2 houses down. I used to spend time with Mary whenever she came here." Her words landed gently, not intrusive but natural, like she had expected this meeting for a long time. George invited her onto the porch, and she placed the basket on the railing. It held tomatoes, cucumbers, and a small loaf of homemade bread wrapped in cloth. "She told me you'd come one day," Helen said as they sat with glasses of iced tea. "Mary always said this house was meant for you. We thought you might need a proper welcome." George's throat tightened at the mention of his wife. He nodded, unable to say much, but Helen seemed to understand. She began to tell him about the neighborhood, how the lake froze solid in winter, how the 4th of July celebrations were still held at the old boathouse, how Mary often brought pies to the community gatherings. "She never said much about her family," Helen added carefully, "but she spoke about you often, said you deserve peace. That's the word she always used, peace." The conversation stretched for nearly an hour, comfortable and easy. George realized quickly that the neighborhood was not the kind of place where people lived anonymously. Here, everyone knew everyone, and the sense of community was tangible. That night, as he ate Helen's bread with his dinner, he felt a quiet gratitude. Mary had not only given him a refuge, but also planted him in a place where he was already accepted. In the days that followed, more neighbors appeared. A retired couple, Frank and Linda, stopped by with a jar of honey from their beehives. A young man named Tom, who lived with his family across the lake, offered to help with any heavy lifting. Each visit carried with it a piece of Mary's unseen life. They all knew her, and through their stories, George began to see a version of his wife he had never fully known. She had laughed here, worked in the garden, even helped organize a small reading group at the local library. One evening, George attended a potluck at Helen's house. The living room buzzed with conversation, the dining table crowded with dishes of casseroles, stews, and pies. When George walked in, the room quieted for just a moment before Helen clapped her hands. "This is Mary's George," she announced warmly. "Be kind to him, he's new." Laughter rippled through the group, and soon George found himself sitting with Frank and Linda, sharing stories of fishing trips he had taken decades ago. Later, a man named Charles offered him a seat by the fire and spoke of Mary's kindness during one particularly harsh winter when his wife had been ill. "She always brought soup," Charles said, smiling faintly. "Never asked for anything in return. That's the kind of woman she was." George listened, his heart heavy yet full. The neighbors did not see him as an outsider. They saw him as someone stepping into Mary's place, carrying on her presence in the community. It was comforting, but it also made him more determined. He could not let Ryan and Chelsea destroy this refuge with their greed. Meanwhile, he continued his quiet preparations. In the evenings, he sorted through the documents Mary had left, filing them into neat folders and making copies. He placed the originals in the hidden compartment beneath the floorboard in the study and stored the copies in a locked drawer. He knew Ryan would eventually come looking, and he intended to be ready. One afternoon, George walked into town to visit the local library. The librarian, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, greeted him warmly. "Mary always reserved the corner table," she said, pointing toward a spot near the window. "Said it had the best light for writing." George took the table and opened his notebook. He began writing letters, not to Ryan or Emma, but to himself. Letters of reminder. What Mary had asked him, what he needed to protect, what battles he might have to fight. He wrote about the lake house, about the neighbors who already cared for him, about the life he was beginning to rebuild. As the days turned into weeks, George felt stronger. The grief did not vanish, but it no longer threatened to drown him. Each neighbor's kindness, each story of Mary's presence, reinforced his purpose. She had not left him alone. She had left him surrounded by allies. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, and George sat on the porch sipping tea, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Emma. "Dad, Ryan is upset. He thinks you're hiding something. Please, can you just talk to him before this gets worse?" George set the phone down and stared out at the lake. He had known this moment would come, but it felt too soon. He closed his eyes, hearing Mary's voice in his memory. Silence can be stronger than anger. He did not reply to Emma. Not yet. Instead, he rose from his chair, locked the door, and placed the phone in the drawer with the copied documents. Tomorrow, he would prepare for the storm that was on its way. The knock came 2 days later, loud and insistent, shattering the quiet rhythm George had begun to enjoy at the lake house. He had been in the garden trimming back the late summer weeds, the scent of damp soil still clinging to his hands, when the sound echoed from the front porch. At first, he thought it might be Helen again, dropping by with fresh vegetables, or perhaps Frank offering to help prepare the dock. But when he opened the door, he froze. Ryan stood there, his suit jacket unbuttoned, his tie loosened but still present, as though he wanted to appear both professional and casual at once. His eyes, however, betrayed his anger. He didn't come alone. Behind him, Chelsea leaned against the railing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, scanning the house with sharp eyes. "Dad," Ryan said, his voice clipped, "we need to talk." George stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. "You drove all the way out here," he said quietly. "Must be important." Ryan walked into the living room, his shoes clicking against the wooden floor. He looked around as though appraising the space, his eyes lingering on the photographs of Mary on the mantel, the neatly stacked books by the fireplace. Chelsea remained near the door, her posture stiff, as if she were ready to pounce the moment George slipped. "This house," Ryan began, turned to face his father. "We found the address in some old files Mom had. I didn't even know it existed. Why didn't you tell us about it?" George met his son's eyes, calm but unyielding. "Because it wasn't yours to know." Ryan's jaw tightened. "Don't play games with me, Dad. Mom owned property out here. Property we had no idea about. And you've been living here like it's some secret getaway. Are you going to explain yourself? Or do I have to get the truth another way?" George walked slowly to the mantel and picked up one of the photographs, Mary smiling on the porch with the lake behind her. He held it in his hands for a moment before replying. "Your mother wanted me here. That's the explanation. She left this place for me." Chelsea finally spoke, her voice sharp. "That doesn't make sense. If this was part of her estate, it should have gone through probate. The attorney never mentioned a second property. If you're hiding assets, that's illegal. Do you really want to go down that road?" George placed the photograph back on the mantel, then turned to face them. His expression was unreadable, but his silence was louder than any outburst could have been. Ryan took a step closer, his voice rising. "We deserve to know, Dad. This isn't just about you. Mom's estate affects all of us. If she left money, if she left property, we have a right to it. You can't just hole up here and pretend it doesn't matter." "You've already sold the Springfield house without asking me," George said, his voice even but edged with steel. "Don't come here and talk about rights." The words hit Ryan like a slap. His face reddened and he clenched his fists. Chelsea placed a hand on his arm, trying to steady him, but her eyes never left George. "You're making a mistake," Ryan said through gritted teeth. "If you think you can just keep this hidden, you're wrong. I'll find out everything. I'll get the courts involved if I have to." George studied his son for a long moment before speaking. "Do what you think you need to do. I'll be fine." The calmness in his tone infuriated Ryan more than any argument could have. He turned sharply, storming toward the door. Chelsea lingered for a moment, her gaze hard and calculating. "You think you're clever," she said softly, "but secrets don't stay buried forever. We'll find out what you're hiding." George didn't answer. He simply opened the door wider, a gesture that was both polite and dismissive. Chelsea joined her husband, and together they left, the gravel crunching under their tires as they sped down the drive. When the silence returned, George stood in the middle of the living room, the weight of the confrontation pressing heavily on his chest. He walked slowly to the study, opened his notebook, and wrote down every word that had been spoken. He underlined one line twice. "I'll get the courts involved if I have to." That night, he sat on the porch, the moonlight spilling silver across the lake. His neighbor's lights glowed faintly in the distance, reminders that he wasn't entirely alone. Still, the threat Ryan had made hung over him like a storm cloud. Mary had prepared him for this. But now the storm was no longer distant. It was at his doorstep. As the crickets chirped and the water lapped gently against the shore, George whispered into the darkness, "You were right, Mary. They wouldn't stop." He tightened his grip on the notebook, knowing he would need every scrap of evidence, every letter, every document she had left him. The fight was no longer about silence. It was about survival. The papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, tucked into a stiff envelope stamped with the county court seal. George found them in the mailbox at the end of the gravel drive, the sight of the official markings enough to sour his stomach before he even opened them. He carried the envelope back to the house, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a long while. He had known this was coming. Ryan's words had made it inevitable. Still, knowing and seeing were two very different things. When he finally tore it open, his hands did not tremble. Inside, the printed words confirmed his suspicion. Petition for temporary guardianship, filed by his son, Ryan Walker. The claim that George Walker, age 68, was no longer sound mind, no longer capable of managing his affairs, and required immediate intervention for his own protection. It was a legal strike designed to strip him of control, not just of the Wisconsin house, but of everything. George set the papers down and leaned back in his chair. The accusation stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed just how little his own son thought of him. To be painted as senile, as incompetent, as unable to decide the course of his own life. It was a betrayal far sharper than the sale of the Springfield house. This was no longer greed disguised as concern. It was greed laid bare, clothed in the language of law. He read the details carefully. The hearing was set for the following week at the county courthouse just 20 miles away. Ryan had moved quickly, no doubt believing George would be blindsided, unprepared, easy to corner. George allowed himself a faint, humorless smile. Mary had expected this, too. She had not left him letters and documents for sentiment alone. She had left them as armor. That afternoon, George drove into town. The courthouse sat on Main Street, a red brick building with white columns that seemed more decorative than functional. Inside, he found the clerk's office and requested a copy of the petition. The woman behind the counter, recognizing his name, glanced at him with quiet sympathy. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker," she said gently as she handed him the file. "These things can be ugly." George nodded, offering a small, steady smile. "I've weathered worse," he replied. After leaving the courthouse, he stopped at the small law office across the street. The brass plaque on the door read Harper and Associates. Inside, a receptionist greeted him, and within minutes he was seated across from a man in his early 40s with sharp eyes and a measured demeanor. "My name's David Harper," the man said, extending his hand. "What can I do for you today, Mr. Walker?" George explained the situation with clarity, laying out the petition, the accusations, and the family dynamics without embellishment. David listened carefully, asking occasional questions but never interrupting. When George finished, the lawyer tapped the papers thoughtfully with his pen. "Temporary guardianship is serious," David said. "If the court believes you're incapable of managing your affairs, they can freeze your assets, appoint Ryan control them, and restrict your independence." But he paused, leaning back in his chair. "From what I'm hearing, this isn't about your well-being. This is about control. Your son is trying to take something that isn't his." George reached into his leather satchel and pulled out the folder he had prepared. Copies of Mary's handwritten will, the letters she had addressed to him, and recent medical documents from his last checkup. He placed them neatly on the desk. "My wife knew this would happen," George said. "She left me proof. Every word she wrote anticipates what my children would do." I also had a full medical evaluation less than 2 months ago. My doctor can testify I'm in perfect health, mentally and physically. I may be old, Mr. Harper, but I'm not broken. David's eyes widened slightly as he skimmed through the documents. These letters, they're powerful, especially the one addressed directly to the court. If your wife left this intentionally, it's going to be hard for any judge to ignore. Combined with your medical records, it paints a clear picture. You're competent, and your son is overstepping. George nodded slowly. Mary made sure of that. She was always thinking ahead. They spent the next hour outlining a strategy. David would file an immediate response contesting the guardianship, including the supporting documents. He also recommended securing affidavits from neighbors in Crandon, people who could attest to George's independence and sound mind. Helen, Frank, and Linda would surely stand with him. When George left the office, the weight in his chest felt lighter. The battle had begun, yes, but he wasn't walking into it unarmed. That evening, Helen stopped by the house with a basket of apples. George invited her in, and as they sat at the dining table, he explained what had happened. Her expression grew stormy as she listened. "Ryan filed that against you?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "That's outrageous. Everyone here knows you're perfectly capable. If you need witnesses, you'll have as many as you want. I'll speak to the judge myself, if I have to." Her conviction comforted him. He thanked her, promising he might take her up on the offer. As she left, she pressed his hand firmly. "You're not alone, George. Don't let him make you believe otherwise." Later that night, George sat by the fireplace. Mary's letter spread before him once again. He read the one addressed to the judge, her handwriting steady and deliberate. "If you are reading this, it means my husband is being questioned unfairly. I have known him my entire life. He is not weak, he is not incapable, and he is not in need of guardianship. He is in need of peace, and I fear his own children may not give him that." Tears blurred his vision, but he forced himself to keep reading. Mary had given him the words he would need, the shield to deflect the strike Ryan had launched. When he finally extinguished the lamp and climbed into bed, George felt not fear, but determination. Ryan believed the petition would corner him, strip him of his strength. Instead, it had given George a reason to fight openly, to show the world and his children that he was far from broken. The judicial blow had landed, but it would not break him. The next morning, George woke before dawn. He had slept lightly, his mind replaying the lawyer's words and the cold language of the petition that sat on his kitchen table. But there was something else nagging at him, something Mary had written long ago. She had mentioned a folder, one she had hidden in the lake house, filled with letters she had written in anticipation of this very storm. George had already found her private will and a few personal notes, but this was different. This was supposed to be her voice, carefully prepared, guiding him when the fight became real. He rose quietly, brewed coffee, and carried a lantern into the study. The floor creaked under his steps as he pushed aside the rug and pried open the loose board where he had already stored important documents. But beneath the satchel, deeper in a narrow cavity, his fingers brushed against the corner of something else. With effort, he pulled it free, a weathered leather folder tied with simple string. George sat at the desk, his heart beating heavily, and untied the knot. Inside were dozens of envelopes, each one marked in Mary's precise handwriting. Some were addressed to him directly, others to Emma, even one to Ryan, but several were labeled differently. To the judge, to the attorney, for when they doubt you. It was as though Mary had mapped out every possible branch of this fight, leaving him with a compass at every turn. He opened the first letter addressed to him. "George, if you're reading this, they've done what I feared. They've questioned your strength, your ability to make your own choices. I wrote these letters because I know you'll want to fight with silence. But sometimes silence is not enough. These words are my weapon in your hands. Use them without hesitation. You've given everything to this family. Now you must protect what is yours." George folded the letter carefully and set it aside. His hands moved to the next envelope, the one marked to the judge. The contents were both startling and powerful. Mary had written directly to any authority who might one day question her husband. To whom it may concern, I, Mary Walker, leave this testimony in full knowledge of my health and state of mind. My husband is a capable man of sound judgment. If anyone brings his competency into question, it is not because of his weakness, but because of their own interest in controlling what is not theirs. My children are dear to me, but they do not always see clearly when money is involved. If they accuse him of frailty, know it is false. I chose to leave certain assets solely in his care, because he is the only one I trust with them. George felt his throat tighten as he read her careful defense. This was no casual letter. It was as if she had sat at this very desk months before, anticipating every step, every word Ryan might speak. She had written a defense so personal, so deliberate, that no judge could easily dismiss it. He went through letter after letter, each one unique. Some were brief notes of encouragement, others detailed explanations of financial movements she had made in preparation for her death. One explained why she had opened separate accounts, describing how Ryan's growing entitlement had worried her for years. Another outlined her fear that Emma, though softer in spirit, would not have the strength to stand against her brother. Then George found a letter addressed to Ryan. For several minutes, he hesitated. He knew opening it was not meant for now, perhaps not ever, but curiosity overcame him. Ryan, I love you, but love does not mean blindness. I see the hunger in you, the drive to control what is not yours. Your father deserves peace, and I know you will try to take it from him. If you are holding this letter, it means you have already begun. Stop before you lose what matters most. Money fades, property crumbles, but the way you treat your father will remain in memory long after he is gone. Ask yourself if this is a legacy you want to carry. George set the letter down, his hands trembling. He wondered if Ryan would ever truly hear those words, or if the hunger inside him had already drowned out his mother's voice. The last envelope he opened that morning was marked only with a single phrase, "For when you doubt yourself." Inside was Mary's handwriting, softer now, almost intimate. George, you've always carried the weight for everyone else. For me, for the children, for the life we built. You think strength is sacrifice, but sometimes strength is saying no. I know you, my love. When you doubt yourself, remember that I trusted you with everything I had. This house, the savings, the letters, they were not accidents. They were choices. I chose you. That is all the proof you will ever need. George leaned back in his chair, tears blurring the words. For a long while, he simply sat there, the sound of the lake outside mingling with the quiet creak of the house. Mary's presence felt so near it was as if she stood behind him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. Later that day, he carried the letters into town. At the law office, David Harper read them carefully, his brows lifting higher with each page. "These are extraordinary," David said finally, laying the stack on his desk. "Most people never think ahead like this. Your wife has given us more than evidence. She's given us motive, context, intent. Judges don't often see this level of foresight in family disputes. These letters could end Ryan's petition before it even gets traction." George nodded slowly. That's what she wanted. She knew them better than anyone. David tapped one of the envelopes. "We'll submit the letter to the judge as part of our defense. The rest we keep in reserve, in case Ryan pushes harder. Trust me, Mr. Walker, this case is looking stronger by the day." As George left the office, a weight lifted from his shoulders. Mary's letters weren't just words on paper. They were her hand reaching out from the past, steadying him, reminding him that he was not walking into this fight alone. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon and the lake glowed with streaks of gold and crimson, George sat on the porch and reread the letter addressed, "For when you doubt yourself." He folded it carefully and slipped it into his breast pocket, close to his heart. The fight was coming closer, but he no longer feared it. Mary had already written the path. All he had to do was follow it. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and dust, the kind of scent that carried both the gravity of history and the chill of bureaucracy. On the morning of the hearing, George rose before the sun and dressed carefully in a dark suit Mary had once insisted he keep for important occasions. He polished his shoes until the leather caught the early light, combed his thinning gray hair, and tucked one of Mary's letters into the inside pocket of his jacket. It was not for evidence. David already had those neatly prepared in his briefcase, but for strength. When he arrived at the courthouse, the square outside was already busy with locals rushing to work or slipping into the small cafe across the street. George walked up the stone steps slowly, deliberately, as though each step was a declaration. He was here on his own terms. Inside, David Harper met him at the security checkpoint. The young lawyer looked crisp, his tie neatly knotted, his eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. He gave George a reassuring nod. "We're ready. The judge will hear arguments this morning." Ryan filed aggressively, but he doesn't realize how weak his case is without proof. George followed him into the courtroom, where the air seemed to hold its breath. The wooden benches creaked as a few neighbors slipped in, Helen among them, her silver hair catching the light. She had insisted on attending, her presence a quiet reminder that he was not alone. Then Ryan entered, flanked by Chelsea. His suit was immaculate, his stride full of practiced confidence. Chelsea carried a thin binder, her eyes darting immediately toward George, narrowing with suspicion. They took seats opposite him, and for a brief moment, father and son locked eyes. Ryan's expression was a mix of determination and contempt, as though he believed the outcome was already secured. The bailiff called the room to order, and Judge Whitmore, a woman in her late 50s with keen eyes and a commanding presence, entered. She adjusted her glasses and scanned the documents before her. "This is the matter of Ryan Walker petitioning for temporary guardianship over his father, George Walker. We will hear arguments." Ryan's attorney, a well-dressed man with a booming voice, rose first. He spoke at length about concern, about responsibility, about the duty of children to protect aging parents. He painted George as a man too shaken by grief to manage finances, a widower vulnerable to mistakes, perhaps even exploitation. His words dripped with practiced sympathy. But beneath it was accusation, that George was no longer capable of standing on his own. Ryan nodded vigorously at each point, his jaw set tight, his hands folded in a show of restraint. Chelsea glanced occasionally toward George, her expression cool, almost triumphant. When it was David's turn, he rose calmly, adjusted his glasses, and spoke with precision. "Your Honor, what we have here is not a matter of care or concern. It is a matter of control. Mr. George Walker is of sound mind and body. We have submitted medical evaluations less than 2 months old, proving his competency. We have affidavits from his community attesting to his independence. And most importantly, we have letters written by his late wife, Mary Walker, anticipating this very attempt." At the mention of Mary's letters, Ryan shifted uncomfortably. His attorney frowned but kept silent as David retrieved the carefully folded pages from his briefcase. He approached the bench and handed them to Judge Whitmore. "These letters," David continued, "were written by Mrs. Walker in her own hand, witnessed by members of her community here in Wisconsin, long before her passing. In them, she makes clear her intention that certain assets, including the lake house where Mr. Walker now resides, be left solely to him. She further warns that her children may attempt to undermine his independence. These are not the words of an outsider guessing at family dynamics. These are the words of a mother and wife who knew her family intimately." The judge read silently for several minutes. The courtroom remained hushed, the only sound a faint shuffle of papers. George watched as Ryan's face flushed redder with each passing moment. Chelsea leaned toward him, whispering sharply, but Ryan brushed her off, his eyes fixed on the judge with growing desperation. Finally, Judge Whitmore set the letters down and looked directly at Ryan. "Mr. Walker, the court takes petitions for guardianship very seriously. They are not weapons for inheritance disputes. Based on the medical evidence, the testimonies provided, and the clear intentions expressed by your late mother, this petition is without merit. It is dismissed immediately." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Helen smiled faintly from her bench, and George felt the weight in his chest lift just slightly. He remained still, his hands folded, his expression calm, though inside a storm of relief surged. Ryan, however, shot to his feet. "Your Honor, you don't understand. He's hiding things. Money, property, my mother." Judge Whitmore silenced him with a raised hand. "Enough. This court is not a place for speculation. Unless you have verifiable evidence, this matter is closed. If you attempt to misuse the court's time again, sanctions will follow. Ryan's attorney pulled him back down, whispering urgently, but the damage was done. His face was flushed with humiliation, his composure cracked. Chelsea avoided George's gaze as she gathered her binder and stood stiffly. When the judge exited, the room emptied quickly. Helen approached George, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You did well," she whispered. "Mary would be proud." George nodded, his throat tight. He thanked her softly, then followed David out into the sunlight. Outside the courthouse, Ryan confronted him, his voice low but seething. "This isn't over, Dad. You think you've won, but I'll find out what you're hiding. I'll make sure everyone knows." George looked at his son for a long moment, his eyes steady. "What I have, Ryan, was given to me, not to you. That's all you need to know." Without another word, he turned and walked down the courthouse steps, each stride steady and unhurried. Behind him, Ryan's frustration hung in the air like thunder waiting to break. The battle had ended in George's favor, but he knew Ryan's hunger would not fade so easily. Still, as he drove back toward the quiet lake house, the folded letter pressed against his heart reminded him of something vital. He was not just surviving this fight. He was living the life Mary had envisioned for him, one step, one victory at a time. The courthouse victory gave George a temporary sense of relief, but once he returned to quiet the lake house, the silence pressed against him differently. For weeks, he had been reacting to Ryan's sudden intrusion, to Chelsea's probing questions, to the petition that tried to strip him of his dignity. Now, with the judge's gavel still echoing faintly in memory, he realized something else. The fight wasn't only about money or property. It was about what his children had become, and perhaps what role he had played in shaping them. That night, he sat at his desk in the study. Mary's letters spread out before him like fragments of a map. His pen hovered over the blank page of his leather notebook. He wasn't writing for himself this time. He was writing to them. The first line came slowly, his handwriting deliberate and careful. "Ryan, Emma, before this goes any further, you need to understand the truth." He paused, staring at the words. It would be easier to remain silent, to let the legal victories speak for themselves. But Mary's voice lingered in his mind. Her plea for him to protect not only the inheritance, but also the memory of who they had once been as a family. He couldn't undo their greed, but he could at least give them clarity, perhaps even a chance to see beyond the dollars and deeds. He wrote for hours. His words were not polished like Mary's, but they were raw, honest. He told them about the nights he had worked double shifts so they could have a better childhood, about the sacrifices he had made quietly, never once asking for recognition. He explained how protecting them from hardship had not made them strong but entitled, and how he feared that his love had been mistaken for obligation. "I gave too much," he wrote, "and in giving too much, I taught you that everything would always be handed to you. That was my failure as a father. Your mother saw it. She tried to prepare for it. This money, this house, this new life she left me, it is not a reward. It is not inheritance. It is a shield she built so that I could finally live without being consumed by your demands." The pen scratched steadily across the page as he continued. He confessed his own weariness, his longing for peace, his realization that love had to mean boundaries. He did not sugarcoat Ryan's ambition or Emma's passivity. He named them plainly, not with cruelty, but with a father's blunt truth. "You will be angry when you read this. You will call me selfish. But selfishness is taking what was never meant to be yours. I will not leave you with nothing, but I will not leave you with the power to destroy the life your mother wanted for me. If you want to know what legacy she wished to pass on, it was not money, it was strength. Learn to build your own lives, not take pieces of mine." By the time he signed his name at the bottom, his hand ached, but his chest felt lighter. He folded the letter carefully, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote their names across the front. He would not send it yet, not until the storm settled. But the words existed now, carved into permanence. The following day, George visited the post office in town. He purchased a small lockbox service and instructed the clerk that the letter was to be mailed only if something happened to him. The clerk, A quiet man who had already grown accustomed to seeing George nodded with understanding. "We'll keep it safe," he promised. On his way back to the house, George stopped at Helen's. She greeted him warmly, ushering him in with the smell of apple pie cooling on the counter. Over tea, he told her about the letter. She listened carefully, her expression both kind and firm. "You did the right thing," she said. "Sometimes children need to hear the truth, even if it's hard. Especially if it's hard. You're giving them a chance, George. What they do with it, that's up to them." Her words comforted him, but he knew Emma would be the one most likely to understand. That evening, he wrote a shorter, separate note to her alone. "Emma, I know you feel caught between me and your brother. You've always wanted peace, even at the cost of your own voice. But peace built on silence is fragile. Speak for yourself, not for Ryan. If you ever want to come here, to the lake house, my door is open, not as a claim, but as a daughter who remembers what family is meant to be." He sealed that note as well, tucking it in the drawer beside Mary's journals. The days that followed were quiet, but the air felt charged, as though waiting for the next move. George kept busy repairing the dock and splitting firewood for the colder months ahead. Yet at night, when the house grew still, he often sat with Mary's letters in his own, reflecting on the strange symmetry of it all. She had written to protect him from the children's greed. Now he had written to protect them from themselves. One evening, as he sat by the fireplace, a message arrived on his phone. It was from Emma. "Dad, I don't know what Ryan's doing anymore. He won't stop talking about you hiding things. I told him we should just leave you alone, but he won't listen. I'm sorry." George stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Emma, you have nothing to be sorry for. One day you'll understand why your mother and I made the choices we did. Until then, know this, I am not angry with you. I never was." Her response came quickly. "I just want us to be okay again." George set the phone down, his heart aching. He whispered into the empty room. "So do I, Emma. So do I." The letter to his children remained sealed, waiting, but the confession was written, the truth laid bare. For the first time in months, George felt he had finally spoken, not aloud but on paper, in words that would outlast both anger and greed. The autumn wind swept across the lake, scattering golden leaves onto the water. The days grew shorter, and with the change in season came a clarity George had not felt in years. The court hearing was behind him, Ryan's accusations temporarily silenced, and Mary's letters remained safe in their hidden place. Yet George felt the house calling for more than just solitude. It was not meant to be a fortress where he hid from his children's greed. Mary had written of building something new, something alive, and the thought had taken root in him. One evening, after supper, he sat on the porch with Helen. She had stopped by with a jar of her honey and lingered to watch the sunset. The lake mirrored the orange sky, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, George broke the silence. "Mary didn't just want me to live here," he said, his voice steady but reflective. "She wanted me to do something with it, something that mattered." Helen looked at him thoughtfully. "What do you have in mind?" George hesitated, then spoke the thought that had been circling his mind for days. "I want this house to be more than mine. I want it to be a place for others like me, people who've lost someone who don't know how to move forward. Mary always gave comfort where she could. I think she wanted me to carry that on." Helen's eyes softened, and she placed a hand gently over his. "That would be beautiful, George. And this community would welcome it. You wouldn't be doing it alone." The idea grew stronger with each passing day. By the following week, George began to put into action. He drew up simple plans in his notebook, turning the spare bedrooms into guest spaces, clearing the garden to make room for vegetable beds that could be tended together, opening the living room for small gatherings. He reached out to David, his attorney, who guided him through the legal steps to register the house as a nonprofit space. "You're certain about this?" David asked during one meeting, scanning the preliminary documents. "Yes," George said firmly. "I've had enough of living only in defense. Mary didn't want me to spend what time I have left protecting myself. She wanted me to build." Word spread quickly through Crandon. Neighbors offered tools, furniture, even their time. Tom, the young man across the lake, came by on weekends to repair the old dock, while Frank and Linda donated a set of sturdy chairs for porch. Helen rallied others to contribute meals or help with painting the interior. Slowly, the lake house began to transform from a private refuge into something larger, a place where grief could find companionship, and where silence was shared rather than endured. George decided to name it Walker House, though the neighbors insisted on calling it Casa Walker, echoing Mary's fondness for the Spanish phrases she had sprinkled into her conversations with them. A simple wooden sign was carved and placed by the driveway, welcoming those who sought comfort. The first guest arrived in late October. A widower named Paul, whose wife had passed the previous spring, came for a weekend. He spent hours on the porch in quiet reflection, later joining George by the fireplace to talk about the hollow ache of an empty house. Then came Margaret, a retired schoolteacher who had recently lost her husband of 50 years. She brought her knitting, filling the evenings with a rhythmic click of needles as stories were shared. George did not preach, nor did he try to fix their grief. He simply listened, offered them a seat at the table, and let the space Mary had created do its work. Each visitor seemed to leave a little lighter, their burdens softened by companionship. Emma visited quietly one Saturday. She came without Ryan, arriving in her small car and carrying a pie she had baked herself. George greeted her at the door with cautious warmth, uncertain what had brought her. "I want to see the place Mom loved," she said softly as she stepped inside. "And I wanted to see you without all the noise." They spent the afternoon walking along the lake, the wind cool but gentle. Emma asked questions about the house, about the neighbors, about Mary's letters. George didn't reveal everything, but shared enough for her to understand that Mary's plans had been deliberate. At one point, Emma stopped and looked at him with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad. I let Ryan drag me into things I didn't believe in. I didn't fight him when I should have. I wanted peace." George placed a hand on her shoulder. "I know. Your mother knew too. You've always wanted harmony. But sometimes harmony comes from standing firm, not staying quiet." Emma nodded, her tears falling silently. That evening, she joined him for supper with the neighbors who had gathered. She listened to stories, laughed at small jokes, and before leaving, hugged her father tightly. "I'll come back," she promised. Ryan, however, remained absent. His silence was not the cry of reflection, but the cold of resentment. George knew his son would not give up so easily, but he also knew he could no longer build his life around Ryan's battles. By November, Walker House had hosted half a dozen guests, each one leaving behind a small token of gratitude, a framed photograph, a knitted blanket, a hand-carved ornament. George placed them around the house, small reminders that grief shared could become something enduring. One evening, as he sat by the fire with Helen and a few visitors, George read aloud from one of Mary's journals. Her words filled the room, her presence wrapping around them all. For the first time since her funeral, George felt that he was not merely surviving her absence, but carrying her forward, piece by piece, through the lives she continued to touch. The reconstruction was not only of the house, it was of himself. Winter arrived quietly in Crandon, blanketing the town in snow that softened every sound and slowed every step. The lake froze at its edges, white mist rising each morning as though the world itself exhaled. George rose early each day to keep the fireplace alive, the warmth spreading through Walker House before the guests came downstairs. The routine was no longer heavy. It felt like purpose. The house, once only his refuge, had grown into something living. By December, there were 3 long-term guests. Paul, who had stayed since October and now helped George chop wood, Margaret, whose knitting had become a staple of the evenings by the fire, and a younger widow named Claire, who had come with her teenage daughter after losing her husband in a sudden accident. Each of them brought stories, burdens, laughter, and silence. Together, they wove a rhythm that Mary would have recognized, a rhythm of healing. On one Sunday afternoon, Emma returned. She arrived with a suitcase this time, asking if she could stay for a while. George welcomed her without hesitation. She joined in the chores, baking bread with Margaret, helping Claire's daughter with her schoolwork, and walking with George along the snowy path to town. She spoke more openly now, her voice no longer carrying the hesitation of someone caught between loyalties. "Ryan doesn't talk to me much anymore," she admitted one evening as they walked home under the glow of the streetlights. "He's angry that I came here, angry that I chose to see for myself instead of following his lead." George looked at her steadily. "And what do you think now that you've seen?" Emma smiled faintly, her breath visible in the cold. "I think Mom knew exactly what she was doing. And I think you're finally where you're supposed to be." Her words filled him with a quiet pride. Emma had begun to see past Ryan's shadow, past her own need to avoid conflict. She was building strength, just as Mary had hoped. The holidays approached, and Walker House became a gathering place. Neighbors brought food and decorations, and the guests worked together to set up a simple tree in the living room. On Christmas Eve, the house glowed with candlelight. George sat by the fire, listening as voices sang softly, not in polished harmony, but in the fragile, real voices of people who had known loss and still chose to sing. For the first time since Mary's death, George did not feel the sharp edge of her absence. He felt her presence woven into every corner of the room. That night, after the others had gone to bed, George sat alone with one final envelope from the leather folder Mary had left behind. He had kept it sealed for months, saving it for the moment he felt ready. The front bore only his name, written in Mary's familiar script. He opened it slowly. "My love, if you are reading this, then you have already walked further than you thought possible. I cannot promise you that our children will understand, but I can promise you that you are not alone. The house is yours, but it was never meant to be only yours. It was always meant to be alive, filled with laughter, sorrow, healing, and hope. If you have built that, then you have given my memory a home as well. Remember, when everything falls apart, that is when you must begin again. You always knew where our true home was. It was never the walls, George. It was the life we made." Tears slid down his face, but they were not heavy with grief this time. They were warm, almost freeing. He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket, close to his heart. In the weeks that followed, George continued to expand Walker House. He opened a small library corner with Mary's books, placed rocking chairs on the porch for visitors to sit by the frozen lake, and started a small garden indoors where Claire's daughter could grow herbs in pots. It was not grand, but it was steady, real, and full of life. Ryan remained absent, his silence stretching into months. Occasionally, George heard from mutual acquaintances that his son was still bitter, still convinced his father had cheated him. But George no longer felt the need to chase his approval. The letter he had written to his children remained sealed in a lockbox at the post office, a truth waiting for them when they were ready. Until then, he chose not to live in their shadows. One crisp morning in February, George stood at the window overlooking the lake. Guests moved about the house behind him, the sound of laughter and clinking dishes filling the air. Outside, a group of widowers from a community gathered by the garden beds they had prepared beneath the snow, already planning what they would plant when spring returned. George smiled faintly at the sight. He slipped Mary's final letter from his pocket, reading the closing lines once more. Then he whispered softly, "You were right, Mary. This is home." The house, warm and alive, echoed with voices and footsteps. It no longer felt like an ending, but the beginning Mary had imagined for him all along.